He asked me one question, and I knew I had to stay. The knock came after midnight, 3 short, deliberate raps that sounded small against the porch, like someone tapping the side of a bowl. I remember the way the lamplight pooled over the warped boards, the smell of rain in the eaves and the faint waft of wood smoke from my neighbor's chimney. My house has always loved silence. It collects absence the way old quilts collect lint. That night the silence felt porous, and when I stood in the doorway in my robe, the darkness across the street seemed less like distance and more like a wall I could climb. Mark stood under his porch light, collar up against the drizzle, holding a small box of parts for a dryer belt he had promised to bring me days earlier. He looked younger than his age when he smiled. 29 with a practical way of moving, the kind of man who knows exactly how a hinge should sit. He had lived across from me long enough to know where my garbage went, long enough to wave when I watered the chrysanthemums in the summer. We weren't close, acquaintances in that neat, neighborly way, until the accident that left my house full of rooms functioning as shrines. I could have sent him away. I could have closed the door and let him go home to his quiet life. Instead, I found myself asking him to come in. I told him then, because the rain made things honest, because saying it aloud seemed easier than keeping it folded in. I wanted another child. I said it like a list of groceries, like something necessary and ordinary. I said it with a kind of trembling that surprised me. I told him I had been thinking about it for years, not because I wanted someone to replace what I'd lost, but because the part of my life that belonged to being a mother had not been finished. I wanted the ache to have a counterpoint, not to erase my husband and the little girl I had lost, but to make room for new stories inside the house that remembered them. Mark listened. He didn't promise anything. He set the box down on my kitchen table, the parts clinking softly, like small bones. He asked questions later, practical ones, timelines, work schedules, whether I had thought it through. He said he was honored, and he said he was afraid. That fear sat between us for a long time like a third person at the table, stirring coffee he hadn't been invited to make. Stay with me. You'll see how everything changed. After he left, the house closed around me with its usual familiar noises. The clock's tick, the fridge's low hum, the way the porch light made a rectangle on the kitchen floor. I moved through those sounds the way you move through a room you know by touch, slowly checking corners I'd memorized. Grief sits in the corners of a life like dust. Some of it you can't stop from settling. Some of it you learn to brush away in the mornings. I brushed away the front-of-house memories until I could breathe without the pressing need to explain. The crash had taken 2 people I loved most. It's a sentence I say and lose something in the mouth. Their names are still in the house in subtle places. The dent where Ella's trike hit the hallway wall. An extra mug that my husband used to keep warm on his workbench. I don't rehearse the accident, but it's the geography behind every decision I make. Taught me that the map of a life can change all at once, that the routes you thought you'd follow can be gone. For years, the house held on to that change like a thing that would go away if I left it alone long enough. As the days folded on, Mark became a sort of weather in my life, not constant but never wholly absent. He fixed an old hinge that had come loose on my back door. He left a bowl of soup on my porch when I had a fever. He pruned my roses in late winter, his hands surprisingly gentle with old stems. These were small things, gestures like stitches, boring, simple, the kind of mending that doesn't look like healing until later. He had a way of showing up that didn't make me feel indebted. It made me feel seen. But the question of what staying would mean kept finding its way into the seams of ordinary days. There were mornings when I woke to the phantom weight of my daughter's small body beside me, and had to remind myself, with ridiculous angry kindness, that sleep can trick you. There were evenings when the silence felt heavy and perfunctory, when the kettle's whistle sounded sudden and accusing. I feared that asking someone to stay was asking them to take on my missing pieces. I feared being seen as someone who wanted to be fixed, someone whose life needed repair in the way an old radio needs a new tube. Mark's fear was different. His was practical at first. What would it mean to be asked to be a father? to be a partner to someone who carried that kind of history. He had his own life of easy routines. A van with a dent in the bumper, a coffee mug that had a chip along the rim, a stereo stacked with records he liked to hum under his breath. He had habits people could count on, and the possibility of entering into something complicated was a disturbance he hadn't planned for. I called Martha once because talk makes heavy things smaller if you let someone else hold one end. Martha is Mark's sister. She's a calm woman with hands that know how to sew, and a voice that finds the practical in whatever mess you hand her. When I told her about the night, she said, "You'd be surprised how steady he can be when someone needs him." She didn't say what I wanted to hear. Go for it or it's impossible. She said something steadier. Be clear about what you want. Let him see the whole thing and then see what he decides. That was the kind of counsel that doesn't lean into romance. It leaned into choice, which felt safer. We tiptoed around definitions for months. We were careful in the way two people who have not promised the world to each other are careful. He would come by when he wasn't billed out on calls, holding a thermos of coffee and the kind of silence that allowed me to speak without having to make the words pretty. We began to find a rhythm in ordinary tasks, loading the dishwasher together, fixing a stubborn cabinet hinge, sorting through a box of my husband's old records. We found that the cadence of practical work can be a conversation. When Mark tightened a screw, it felt like a small yes. When I folded a blanket he'd made softer in the dryer, it felt like a small answer back. One rainy afternoon, after he'd come over to replace a faulty switch, I found a drawer he'd left open and a pair of my husband's gloves inside, folded the way my husband used to fold them. It was tender and terrible at once. I could have shut the drawer and never opened it again. Instead, I closed it and set the gloves on the table where the sunlight, slanting through the kitchen window, could warm them. Small acts like that passed between us, rituals that stitched our edges together. When I told Mark I'd made up my mind to try, he didn't leap. He leaned. He asked for clarity about timing and about the practicalities of work and whether I'd seen a doctor. We agreed to go to the clinic together for a consultation. I didn't want to go alone, and I didn't want to pretend this was only my choice or only his. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and coffee, like every place in the world that tries to make you feel both private and procedural at once. The nurse took our histories with a practiced calm and set up an ultrasound when the dates aligned. I remember Mark's hand in the chair beside me, ready to hold when the technical voice said things I could not understand. He wasn't glib about the possibilities. He never promised an easy road. He promised to be there for the appointments, and then he was. The test itself was a small, ridiculous private ritual, a plastic stick that waited like an oracle in my bathroom. I stood over the sink with it clutched in my hand while the world outside moved along. The line appeared before I had time to breathe, a precise thin mark that reoriented everything. Joy arrived like a bruise, sudden, painful, and impossible to ignore. I called Mark because the phone felt less than honest. I wanted his voice to be the first to hold the news. He came over in 20 minutes like he could, and I watched him read my face before he even asked. When he saw the way my mouth opened and the sound I made, not a laugh, not a sob, something between, his hands found mine and didn't let go. Pregnancy is a slow revelation. There are small ways that time counts, the nausea that receded and returned like tides, the way my appetite changed, what I could tolerate on the stove. There were appointments on calendars, scans that showed us shapes that didn't look like much to anyone else but to us had meaning. We told no one at first, simply because the thing felt fragile. For a few quiet weeks we existed in a kind of private suspense, and in that privacy, our connection deepened. Mark learned to read my silences. I learned to trust his presence without him making promises I couldn't rely on. There was a night, 6 weeks after the positive test, when fear crawled back toward me like a familiar animal. A storm had come through, and the house felt smaller under the weight of the rain. I'd been up with phantom contractions that turned into nothing, with grief visiting like an uninvited guest. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold, and a pile of bills that seemed to argue the point about ordinary life. No matter what was happening inside me, the pipe still needed attention. The cat still needed feeding. The washer still needed new belts. The world does not wait for miracles, it waits for paid invoices. Mark came by with 2 bowls of stew. He knew by then when to bring dinner and when to bring silence. He set a bowl in front of me and sat down across the table. Outside, the sky was a smear of gray. Inside, the lamp made a circle of gold on the tabletop. He watched me stir my stew as if measuring his words by the spoon's rhythm. He had been quieter than usual for weeks, like he was negotiating something in his own chest. "I can't promise I'll fix everything," he said suddenly. It wasn't a theatrical line, it was a factual one, spoken with the kind of humility that made the words land with weight. "I can't promise I won't mess up. I can't promise it's going to be easy. But—" He looked at me then, really looked, and in his eyes there was a steadiness that had been growing quietly when the rain fell, and when the coffee went cold. "If I choose you, will you stay with me? Will you let me be here with you and this baby?" He said it as a question. It was not a plea, it was an invitation. The way he framed it left room for me to say no. It left room for my history, my fear, my grief to have weight in the answer. That was the miracle in the sentence. It asked for my consent. It named his choosing as an active thing, not something that happened to me. Hearing those words, I felt the outline of something new, a shape made not from filling a hole but from building together. I knew then, in the quiet, in the way the lamplight skated on the tea, that staying would not be a yielding. It would be a decision made every day. It would be an ordinary, stubborn kind of love, the kind that shows up with warm soup and with steady hands at 2 a.m., and that can name fear without letting it decide everything. The question he asked had a force I hadn't expected. It didn't erase what had been lost. It offered a way to hold it differently. We said that we would try. We promised to tell the truth as we went along, to speak when something felt like too much, to get help when we needed it. We set small rules about money, about time, about how we'd handle visits from people who might complicate things. None of these things were glamorous. None of them were poetic. They were practical, the true scaffolding of a household deciding to expand. Pregnancy has a way of pulling old grief into the present in new shapes. Sometimes I'd be standing at the sink, and a memory would tilt me sideways, the sound of a little voice, a small hand in mine, and I'd have to go sit down for a minute and let the world stop spinning. There were nights when the future seemed impossible, when I would walk from room to room cataloging what belonged to the past. Mark learned to stand in those moments like a lighthouse. He didn't try to take the grief away. He learned how to coast with it, to hold a space where it could be present without being permitted to define everything. Martha came by more often over these months. She brought me a cardigan she'd knit, yellow as the chrysanthemums I liked to keep on the porch. She and Mark would talk quietly in the doorway while I made tea, and sometimes the 3 of us would sit together, like an unlikely family. Martha's steadiness proved to be a small miracle of its own. She never tried to smooth the edges. She suggested practical fixes when I panicked and baked when we needed something warm on the table. Her presence felt like a hand on the shoulder of whatever we were trying to build. The clinic became a place that held our little milestones. There were ultrasounds where a small flicker became a heartbeat audible in the dark. There were tests that returned as cautious good news. We learned the rhythms of doctors' schedules and how to read the silence after a nurse leaves the room. We started to choose names quietly, as if naming was a way to try on futures. Not big, bold names, but small and clean. Names that fit a house you could imagine a child living in. Lily came to me while I was pruning the roses, the name humming through my head with the simplicity of a seashell's curve. I said it aloud one evening and Mark didn't argue. There were practical worries. Insurance paperwork that felt like a foreign language, nights of recalculating budgets so that we could afford prenatal vitamins and a few things a baby would need. We did not pretend everything would be easy. I counted bills the way you count breaths when the room is too loud. There were arguments that were sharp and immediate, about money, about boundaries, about what to tell other people and when. We were both stubborn in ways that surprised us. But the arguments were short-lived when the stakes were as ordinary and essential as making sure there would be a crib when the time came. When the line between months blur, life turns into a montage of small rituals. Mark learned how to tie a bassinet sheet with a knot I would later appreciate at 3 in the morning. I taught him how to swaddle in a way that came less from manuals and more from the way my hands had wrapped around my daughter years before. We painted a small corner of the spare bedroom a pale blue, then changed our minds to a softer, genderless green. We spent an afternoon at a store picking out a small mobile, a paper bird that would spin lazily above a baby's head. It felt both ridiculous and tender, every tiny choice a vote for a future we both wanted to step into. There are moments in a life that thread themselves through memory like stitches. The hospital arrival on a bright spring morning was one of those for me. The sound of the car door closing, the way Mark's hand found mine with that easy decency he'd always had, the scent of antiseptic and coffee that makes hospitals feel like both an ending and a beginning. Labor is not cinematic in the way stories sometimes want it to be. It is work, honest and bodily. There was pain that came in waves and times when I felt untethered. There was also a kind of clarity in the intensity. Decisions are easier in that focus. The world simplifies to one thing. Mark was there, not as a hero, but as a companion. He was the person who kept a cool cloth on my brow, who whispered a joke once to make me breathe through a contraction, who held me up when the edges began to blur. He didn't perform grand gestures. He made tea in the small hours. He kept a steady voice. He rubbed lotion into my sore hands. When the nurse said it was time to push, he did not try to do more than be present. Later, when Lily was finally placed on my chest, slick and small and startlingly alive, Mark cried like someone who had been given a book and didn't yet know the language. He said my name in a whisper, as if checking it still belonged to me. Naming a child is a private thing. We had said the name together once, half joking, and then stopped talking about it because names have weight, and sometimes the mere act of speaking a name is a kind of risk. When we put the name Lily into the room, it felt like setting a small boat on water. It did not erase losses, it sat alongside them. My husband's photo still had a place on the mantel, and there was an empty chair at the table that would always carry a quiet ache. But in the crook of my arm was a new pulse, a new set of tiny fingers that curled like a secret. Lily's cry was thin and fierce. Mark laughed, a small sound full of stunned gratitude. "Hello, Lily," he said, as if meeting someone he'd always been waiting for, and I let the name settle against my heart. After the initial rush of delivery and hospital rooms and visitors, life at home returned to its careful work. Night feedings rearranged our internal clocks. There were dark hours when my breasts were full and exhausted, and we learned to move around each other's sleep the way two people learn to pass a single bed without waking. We navigated relatives who wanted to be helpful and strangers who offered more than advice. We learned to accept offers and to set boundaries when offers had strings. Parenthood, we found, is built of small agreements made over and over. On an evening some months later, when the air had a touch of summer and the chrysanthemums on the porch had returned to their familiar riot of yellow, Mark and I sat on the swing beneath our shared porch light. Lily slept indoors, a small muffled pattern of breath from the monitor on the kitchen table. We swung slowly, in the way old friends do, letting the motion be the conversation when words were too big. "You asked me something that night," I said finally, because some truths only seem to want to be said when the light is soft, and someone is there to receive them. "You asked me if I would stay." He nodded, his profile a bruise of shadow against the porch light. He reached over and took my hand. His fingers had the same steadiness I'd come to rely on, calloused in the right places, warm with the kind of skin that remembers work, and also remembers to love. "If you hadn't asked it that way," I said, "I think I might have kept explaining myself forever." "Maybe," he said. "But I wanted to make sure it was your choice. I didn't want you to ever feel like I had been persuaded by pity. Pity is a quiet danger in the presence of grief. It can make kindness feel like a transaction. What Mark had offered instead was agency. He had framed his commitment as something he was choosing, while giving me the right to say yes. That had been the turning point. When someone asks to choose you while asking you to choose them back, it is different from being rescued. It is a partnership of wills. I stayed because I wanted to. I stayed because his question gave me room to be myself, in all my complicated ways. I stayed because we built a home that respected the ghosts, that would always be there, and still made space for laughter that was brand new. I stayed because staying felt like an active love, not a settling. There are days when grief still washes up like driftwood on our shoreline. We talk about my husband sometimes, out loud, so that his story doesn't dissolve into silence. We tell Lily about the people who loved her before she existed, as if stitching her into the long line of our lives. Sometimes in the quiet, I hear my daughters laugh in the backyard, and it knocks something loose inside me, a memory, a note, that I cradle rather than smooth over. That is how we live with what was lost, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by letting its presence shape us without being our only shape. People sometimes ask me whether Lily fixed me. I never answer with a simple yes because it's not true. No child or person can fix another adult's brokenness. Healing is communal, slow, and sometimes messy. It is an accumulation of small rituals. Someone fixing a dryer belt at midnight, a sister knitting a cardigan, a neighbor pruning roses so they will bloom again. It's the everyday work of making food and paying bills and saying the hard words. It is the repeated choosing to be present even when presence is inconvenient. On nights when I sit on this porch watching my child sleep and Mark mend something small in the garage, I sometimes feel like I'm in the middle of an ordinary miracle. Not the kind that rewrites everything, but the kind that builds quietly over time. A life stitched together with steady hands. A family formed by choice as much as by history. He asked me one question, and I knew I had to stay. Because staying was no longer a surrender to a loneliness that had defined me. It was a deliberate, repeated choice to build something alongside a person who had chosen me back. It wasn't a denial of the past. It was an embrace of the present, raw and imperfect and full of the hard, gentle work of keeping someone else in your life. If this story sat with you for a moment, if you find yourself thinking of the small ways people show up for one another, perhaps you'll stay for more of these quiet stories. They are, after all, how we remember what it means to keep choosing. If you want to hear another, come back. There's room on this porch.